All right. Okay. So I'm just a little bit drunk, but that wasn't intentional. But okay, so obviously, my talks on lack are a little bit, or probably a lot, very polemical in nature. I see that my talks on excess are very polemical. Um, so how can I begin with this? I'm going to try to begin with representing the structure or the logical structure of lack in the sense that it has been sort of explained to me in a sense, right? So people could, if somebody, tell me if I'm wrong, if I get this basic generalization wrong, right? So what I'm understanding from people that take the lack as the ontological structure. What I'm understanding is that you as a subject, you realize that you lack, right? And then the point of having this lack is that you eventually face your lack. And through facing your lack, you encounter excess, right? It is basically a kind of nice and neat Hegelian negation of negation, right? You, yeah, so the subject realizes this lack and so on, right? And so this is supposed to represent, from what I understand, the phenomenological experience of the subject. Okay. All right. So if I understand that argument from lack, and if that's the argument from lack that I'm seeing, that essentially the logic for the ontological structure of lack is that we fundamentally lack as beings. We face our lack, and through facing our lack, we sublimate that through a negation of negation, sort of Hegelian style or Freudian style, if you say. And then we encounter the excess. And so my argument is predicated on the sort of inverse of that argument. And the reason why I inverse that argument is because to me, it's not ironic enough. It's not ironic enough to the human experience. And so basically, what I'm saying is that if excess is already possible via realization, then excess is already there, right? By virtue of the fact of realization. Uh, so that's basically my inverse argument that I'm saying, oh, yeah, that means the ontological structure is excess, right? Because it's already there. Now, again, the reason why I'm pressing this hot button is because, in my opinion, anywhere you say lack, I can invert it and say excess, right? So, for example, right, the notion of the split subject is it's a very common, Freudian, Lacanian, the notion of the split subject. Well, that can be easily explained through excess as well, right? Through the fact that it's such an excess in order to understand or even conceptualize anything, the subject must split itself. It must split itself and then go through this, you know, phenomenological experience of lack as such, right? So you can say, so I can actually say, actually, the split occurs because out of necessity, because of the excess, right? The excess must make sense of itself. So out of consequence, it splits the subject. That means that we can have a observer observing the observer within the subject, right? That I am self-conscious of my own thoughts, and so on. Now, the other really polemical thing about this is that this argument between lack and sort of this linear progression, like, okay, you have to sublimate and then, keep sublimating and so on. It's not, it's not too, like, the logic behind it is not too new, meaning like Buddhism had a similar debate. Buddhism, like, there's aspects of Buddhism, certain divisions of Buddhism that felt like you had to go through this kind of process to get somewhere, right? Go through a kind of enlightenment. But then, like, for example, like Mahayana Buddhism, they cut that whole linear progressive understanding, right? They basically say, you already have it, right? You already have it. Um, and so I caught this, I caught this because I can't help but see how there's an underlying logic of like a progressive, like, striving, right? Which is fine. But then the opposite of that basically already says, like, you already have it. You know, you could say in the Christian realm, this is similar to Lutheranism. You're already saved. You just have to receive it. But in like Mahayana Buddhism, you already have it. You already have Buddha nature, right? It's you just have to realize it. But so I think it's on this very notion of realization, right? I saw that a lot of the rebuttals were on this concept of realization. The thing is, we can realize in a multiplicity of ways, right? We can either have like a sort of after the fact realization, but see, the problem with an after the fact realization is that you have to sort of assume a linear progress of development, right? But what I'm trying to say is that the development is already inherent within the ground that the one is thinking. Um, this is something similar to, like, for example, a mirror, a dusty mirror, right? Now, can we say that a dusty mirror lacks reflectivity? Of course. But does it mean that it actually, like, the actual reflexivity of the mirror does not exist, is not there until it is realized? See, there's several ways that we can look at that, right? And this is what I'm pressing on, right? You can argue that the structure is lacking, of course, right? But it's the same way that I can argue that excess, because it's such an excess, it's such an excess in itself, right? The subject cannot pin itself down, right? And so in this case, it would, feel like a lack, and so on. um, so, but I personally feel like this debate is kind of contingent, like, on a sort of older forms of debate, but of course it's taken a different form because it's kind of like the logic of like a progressive model. And it's funny because it's funny that this argument is or like not an argument, but it's funny, like, these rebuttals are happening because fundamentally Nishida kind of critiques Hegel for this, right? He critiques Hegel for kind of having this nice, neat, progressive model, right? Sublimation, 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 right? Nishida says, no, that doesn't have to be, right? You already, like, you already have it, right? You already have it. Um, so There's several ways that we can look at this realization. We can look at this realization as a kind of unfolding, or we can look at it as a sort of like you can't perceive the unfolding until you realize it. So that means there's already a lack, right? But then there's a way to sort of inverse that where you say, well, that's what has to happen with excess as the primary structure, right? Excess in itself has a sort of indeterminate point, which it creates. Excess already creates the notion of contingency, creates the notion that the subject has to split itself in order to reflect upon itself. So the very fact that um, the realization, you have to go through the realization to realize that it's an excess, to me already proves that the excess was there prior to the realization. Um, and so, you can kind of see how this can, you know, go back and forth. But now, let me put it this way. I am not dismissing lack in its entirety. I'm just pressing this hot button to show, because I feel like it's just not ironic enough to me, and I'm sure that statement is polemical in itself, because it's like the obvious, right? The obvious answer or the obvious thing to resonate with would be like, yeah, it's lack. Duh. And like, even if you talk to people about it, right? They don't even need to know about Lacan or Zizek. You'd say, look, human beings lack. People are like, yeah, totally, right? But to me, that is just not ironic enough. And if you're missing my point on excess, it's the point is that the ontological structure is irony. And to me, there is nothing more ironic to say that the human being is fundamentally in excess of itself. Now, because this foundation is predicated on a Freudian, Zizekian, Lacan, Hegel kind of framework, we can always find problems with that, right? And there's a lot of ways where it's like, is lack the actual structure, or did excess sort of, in order to make sense of itself to itself, had to create what we would call a symbol of lack as such. And it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of notions, a lot of theological notions where it's like God is inside you, God is already there, God is near, right? This very idea that the excess is already there, so to speak. And I think, there's another statement about lack isn't contingent. Well, the same thing with excess, right? Excess doesn't have a contingency because it creates contingency. The very fact that you have to cut it to make sense of itself is already the creation of contingency. You go, oh, look, from that point to that point, to this point to that point. And so already, we have this understanding. But I think the one of the reasons why I'm pressing this hot button on excess, right? I'm saying the hot button on excess is because I feel like for some people, for some individuals, right, this notion of lack does not appeal to them in such a way. It doesn't, it doesn't capture something, and that's something that I realized. So basically, I feel like out of necessity, I have to present this notion of excess to leave room for those that don't feel like it captures how they interact with reality. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be talking about the biological notions of lack, because as you know, as some of you already know, there's a difference between need and lack. So that distinction has already been made, but not by me. But not by me. That was made by Daniel Gardner. So you know, yeah, that's why I'm not going into that biological realm, because then we'd be talking about need, and fundamentally, I accept that need portion. Um, and there's so many ways again that you can cut this up, right? There's so many ways. Um, and one of my things with excess is that, for example, the very fact that we have thinkers that we use, that are predicated on the unconscious and so on, is that what's ironic about this is that it took consciousness to decide what the unconscious was. So basically, it was consciousness self-determined what unconscious is in some type of fashion. And this very self-determinacy of the subject in attempt to understand itself from its own ground is already like in excess of itself, in my opinion, right? And to kind of point at the excess is the very fact that man was already gifted with resources of excess, meaning like imagination, creativity. Um, the very fact that, for example, this notion of this theological notion, I don't know how I don't know how provocative it is to some people, but I know Islam talks about it, where it's like the whole point is to become a sort of co-creator with God. So how would we have the capacity to become co-creators with God if we did not already have some of the ontological structures for excess, right? You know what I mean? Now, it may be true, right? For example, we can argue the inverse, on the notion of lack. Like, I didn't choose for my being. I didn't choose for my being to be this way, right? That's a lack. I didn't choose existence. But what's ironic about this is that even though you didn't choose existence, you didn't choose to be hungry, you can just as easily override the self-determinacy of that, meaning you can choose to starve yourself, right? There's nothing that stops you from the fact of starving yourself, right? Or ending your own life, right? Um, so already you have the resources of excess, of self-determinacy in some type of way. Even the notion of restricted conditions, right? I have no legs, I have no arms. The very resources of excess can change your attitude. You can accept those things, right? So again, there's so many ways that we can choose to say lack, and we can choose to say excess as the same inverse order. But again, my kind of play on this is like, ultimately, man always makes that choice, right? That this is the framework that he wants to begin from in some ways, right? Lacan, Zizek, any philosophical structures, this is a choice that resonates with their experience and makes sense of their reality. But then there's this interesting thing where it's like there's people that are out, there's other thinkers outside of Freud, Lacan, Zizek, Hegel, and so on, right? And to me, right, we can, this is what's interesting, right? We can say like, the very creation of distinctions and new philosophical thoughts is proof of lack, right? We can say that, right? But also the same way can be said, well, actually, the very proof that distinctions happen and more philosophical systems occur and so on is actually the proof of excess, right? It's already the proof of excess. The very fact that you realize in the midst of excess that, oh, here, cut, here, cut, 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 cut. So it's just the inverse process, right? But like Kierkegaard, I'm a little bit critical about I always like Kierkegaard for this reason. Kierkegaard, it seems like he was always critical about Christians, you know, very critical about Christians while he himself is a Christian, right? I feel like sometimes the same role needs to be played um, in this sense, where the Kant, Zizek, Hegel, they sort of have melded Christian thought very well, right? Has been a nice cooking pot for Christian thought. Um, at least, again, don't murder me for this generalization. That's just my observation. It seems a lot of the Hegelians, Zizekians have some relation to Christianity in some way, in some manner. So whether they were originally against it or still kind of against it or now for it, and now trying to read Kant and Zizek through a Christian lens, again, sort of Christian undertones, right? Whereas like the moment I start thinking about a different theological structure or a different theological undertone, right? For example, in the Quran, it says that everything was written. Everything is written, right? Everything is written. So this is what Muslims actually struggled with theologically. Like, okay, well, if everything's written, so like that's weird. Wouldn't like me doing something bad would already, God would already know about it, but then that also mean that I was already predetermined for hell and so on. Right? So um that's the kind of Muslim kind of discrepancy that Muslim theology had to work through. But actually, Muhammad Iqbal kind of says the opposite. It's like, yeah, you assume that, but you're supposed to be a co-creator with God, you know? And that means if you're supposed to be a co-creator with God, that means you create your destiny in that sense. And that means that that destiny is the one that is written, that is yours based on your choice. And it's like this paradoxical thing that Muslims can't, it's hard for a lot of laymen to kind of make sense of, right? um, but yeah, in my opinion, we're already granted the resources for excess. Creativity, imagination, they're just overwhelmingly so. And the very fact that it participates in our interpretation of saying that this is a lack, in my opinion, is also kind of proof of that, right? And the fact that we constructed some type of system, some type of way of thinking, that sublimation is a process, that realization is a part of the process, that facing lack is a part of the process, and all that thing. And the other kind of funny inversion with facing lack. Yeah, this has been probably my most ironic inversion of facing lack, right? So my funniest inversion of facing lack is that actually before there's lack as experience, there's the choice to choose lack as experience. And that very choice is the constitution of lack as such, meaning that the moment you make a choice, you sacrifice every other possibility, every other possibility. And so the moment that you sacrifice possibility, you begin to lack. So it's the very fact that as human beings, we have the choice to cut into the excess. That choice itself, in my opinion, is already you facing the lack, right? So this is the kind of ironic twist that I'm pulling on facing lack, where it's like, actually, before you can say that experience is lack, you've made the choice to interpret your experience as lack. And the moment you've made that choice, you sacrificed all possibilities to reinterpret your experience as such. And that is the constitution of that choice itself. That lack is the choice, because fundamentally, in order to face lack, you have to make a choice. And see, again, this is my funny inversion of the whole thing. Of the whole thing. And this is why I'm like ironically twisting the whole thing on itself. Because to me, what I'm saying is, right, if you're if you're saying that we have to choose, right? We have to make a choice. That means beforehand, we already made the choice to look at our experience as a fundamental lack. And the moment you make that choice, in some ways, you have already chosen to face your lack. And that is part of the irony that I am trying to spur out here. Okay, so I think I got to most of the rebuttals on that. Now, of course, we can make more complex arguments like language and so on. But again, I think it's going to have the, if you don't think, if you don't think that I won't find an inversion of that in some way, because I've been thinking about almost every possible way. But then it's like, then I catch myself in my own irony where I just keep creating another excess, right? I could say, oh, well, lack is a symbol, so it's just a symbol to bear with reality, because really the ontological structure is excess, right? I could say that, but already I'm sort of playing with the excess. I'm already playing with the excess of my resources, adding another division, adding another distinction, adding another thing, so on. But I think, again, to stay more true to the individual, in almost very Kierkegaardian sense, I think it's important in some ways that, I wouldn't say that my philosophy is universal. I wouldn't say that it is. I would say it's just another way of explaining, another way of looking at the world, another way of the subject wanting to live its truth out, like Kierkegaard would say, And as long as you can do that, I don't see that. Now, I will address some other more succinct rebuttals, meaning like, for example, I think I heard something like, oh, push and pull, right? This distinction between push and pull. The very fact that we have a decision between push and pull is proof of the excess. The very fact that we have a distinction between motivation as between intrinsic and extrinsic is already proof of the excess. So all these divisions who sort of like push back against my own my own assertions kind of has like a somewhat ironic bind as well, right? It has an ironic bind, right? Just the same way just the same way the inverse argument could be said, right? Like, oh, Javi lacks, so that's why he created the philosophy of excess. The same inversion can happen, right? But again, I could interpret my experience like, well, that interpretation was not capturing something, right? And I felt like, yeah. And then I could say that actually that's the result of like the haunting excess that is sort of impeding on me, right? Wanting to flow out. Now, again, you could say that it's stuck on intrinsic motivation, but my response would just be like the very fact that you have a division between extrinsic and intrinsic is already kind of proof of the excess. The very fact that people might feel like there's a push theory or a pull theory, again, for me, another proof of the excess. Um, so yeah, I want to say I think I captured everything. The only thing I didn't get to talk about was my metaphor of the slinky. So just like a slinky, right? Just like a slinky, just because the first ring may be your first immediate experience of quote lack, doesn't mean that the excess is not there, right? Now you can say this. You could say, well, I could say, right, that the excess is always there. It's just you have to encounter its unfolding, right? It's stretching out as such, right? It's stretching out. And this like actually ironically might even play with my philosophy of timing, right? That you have to experience a kind of, go on. You have to experience a kind of timing in order to acknowledge the unfolding. But again, to me, the excess is already imminent within. It's already imminent as a presence there. And yeah, I think that's really it. What else? Oh, well, I guess because, we're all, I guess to be more polemical, I'll quote Jung. I'll quote Jung here, where Jung says, it is impossible, in fact, to distinguish between a symbol of the self and the God image. How am I interpreting that? Well, it would be kind of like saying how the symbol of the self, symbol of lack, can't be determined, possible to determine from the excess of the image. But yeah, there's so many ways that you can play with this, in my opinion. I think that's my main point. There's so many ways that you can play with this, and I think, of course, the very fact that we interpret the experience as a lack, because of course you have to overlay it with some type of hermeneutics. I mean, it's obvious that it's overlaid with a kind of hermeneutics, right? To some degree, we do choose to interpret it as such, and to some degree, we do choose to interpret it as a sublational structure. So yeah, I think there was something else I was going to bring up, but I think I'll probably talk about that in the next video, because I have enough to say about that. Haunted, yeah, we're haunted by the excess. And oh yeah, final note. I think now, I know there was, there's some comments being made about Nietzsche not taking lack seriously enough. Well, there's a lot of ways to think about that. In my opinion, actually, there's a case of not thinking excess seriously enough. Because we decide to go with the model of lack. We prefer to go with the model of lack. right? Because there's something about it that's just sort of obvious to our experience, right? But I think Nietzsche is probably one of the first philosophers that thinks excess seriously. And I think it's this very notion of the will to power. Um, because power is such an excess that it's just not satisfied with itself. Um, and that's the other irony that I play on too, right? Excess cannot be satisfied. Why can't it be? Well, because it's an excess. Um, so yeah, I kind of interpret Nietzsche as like a real serious philosopher on excess instead. Um, and that really, and I think it kind of makes sense why he stresses the notion of creation, create your values, creativity, imagination, art, and all this other stuff, right? Because kind of focusing on the things that you lack is already kind of, how can we put it, already universally twisted, right? You didn't yourself accept, like, you never made a real choice, so to speak, right? At least for Nietzsche, like, you never made a real choice because you're sort of listening to the societal structure, right? And this is his critique of Christianity, of morality, and everything else. Um, and there's a way in which we can interpret that the excess itself is a kind of burden that must go through a kind of catharsis, right? This is interesting. A self emptying, a kind of kenosis, um, which is kind of funny in a weird way because, right, you can go the Hegelian route where it's like, okay, a being lacks, goes through a self kenosis, and then realizes excess, right? But then there's this other way that you can look at it where it's like, oh, I know why values are so burdening, because the ontological structure is such an excess. And the very acceptance of a universal model of moral ethics and values kind of makes heavy that burden, right? To which Nietzsche says you must create to get rid of that excess. Create your values. Go beyond this and keep going beyond this because you have the very structures to do so. So again, I you know, if we're gonna disagree about if lack is the ontological structure or if excess is the ontological structure, I will propose an interesting thing, which I don't think people would disagree with, which is the very fact that the ontological structure is irony, which is why, as a kind of like rhetorical device, I've been saying it's excess because that is just the most ironic thing to say about the human being. Like, it's obvious that the human being lacks, right? But the most ironic thing would be to say that no, the human being is such an excess of itself, right? It's such an excess of itself that it carries inhuman elements, um, which we can interpret as divine, as the divine within us, um, as that sort of potential. Um, but yeah, I think I finished. I think I addressed everything that I wanted to address. I mean, of course, what makes this conversation difficult is because so many people approach it from Lacan, and then and so on, and people approach it from Zizek, and I get it. I don't necessarily dismiss those thinkers, but I'm really just trying to press the hot button on there's another way that you can look at this, right? There's another way to look at this where you still ironically face something, right? But in this case, the lack that I'm talking about is the very choice that you make is that lack, because out of all of the excess, you chose in some fashion how to perceive this experience, what medium of art to put it on, and even despite all restrictive physical factors on your body, like Viktor Frankl says, at the end of the day, at the very least, you still have the choice to choose an attitude, right? And it's this very attitude in the midst of such compression that, to me, already proves, out of all the possible attitudes, out of all the possible choices, whether you thought of them or not, you sacrificed possibilities. You sacrificed excess in order to do something. And there's a way that you can look at the Jesus story the same way. Like Jesus coming down as man, God coming down as man, that's him choosing to cut the excess and present himself as a choice, right? As a human being. And just again, there's just so many ways. I mean, I don't know how many examples I could give to play along, to keep playing with the idea of excess, but yeah, again, if there's still disagreements, I don't think this specific part would be a disagreement, meaning that the ontological structure is fundamentally ironic, and that would be my exact stance, right? The fundamental structure is ironic, but because it is, that's why I kind of laughably say it's excess, because to me that is just, it has to be the most ironic thing to human experience, right? That the human being is in excess of itself. The very fact that we have to reach out to another human being, excess of itself. This reaching out, excess of itself, right? Can't see my back of my own head, but I can reach out to somebody to tell me what my back of the head looks like. You can interpret that as a lack. You can. It just really depends. Like, again, is this a sort of like the very fact that the excess forces you to reach out, the excess forces you to be communal, the excess forces you to have this constant returning, a constant repetition. Why? Because the excess cannot be satisfied. Because if it could be satisfied, well, then love would be kind of pointless, wouldn't it? We wouldn't be able to continue talking to our lover because our lover would have already satisfied, right? So there you go. But you could say, right, inversely, just as confidently, that because there's lack, because he lacks, that it drives us to each other, right? It drives us to each other, which I can say the same inverse, right? Because I have an excess of myself, he has an excess of himself. It drives us to each other in some fashion. It drives us because we're just driven by it, because it's such an excess, right? It's not enough because this is an excess. and that's the kind of ironic twist that I'm playing with lack, with this idea that it's not enough, which is so funny because even excess, because it's an excess, it's not enough. That's the irony of it all. It's not enough. You can't pin it down because it's an excess, so it's not enough. You can't grab at it because it's not enough. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now I think I addressed everything for this topic. I forgot some things, but I think I said the most important parts. So, all right. Okay. Well, hope you guys take care. I am sure I will have comments and oh, thank you, Michelle. Okay. All right, guys. Take care. Bye.